We'll just give a few more seconds for everyone to tune in, and then we'll get started. Okay, good afternoon, everybody, and welcome to our NZIOB webinar on extensions for time in an Omicron environment. We have nearly 300 people on the Zoom today, so it's certainly a hot topic out there. My name's Graham Burkhead. I'm the immediate past chair of NZIOB and current director. So to keep things moving, we'll answer questions at the end, and please log them on through the Zoom. So in my day job, discussions with project contractors and clients in recent times, the biggest issue is always supply chain. But in the last few months, the changing face of COVID-19, particularly the Omicron variant, has heaped more pressure on supply chains. Projects are facing a 10 to 20% reduction in workforce some days. I even heard last week of a project that was down 50% of the workforce. So what does this mean for our industry, and in particular for project completion dates and risk? In lockdown, EOTs were easier. Just the lockdown duration helped us deal with that. But how do you deal with 20% of your workforce away from work? So at short notice, and to try and address all that, NZIOB have reassembled its extension of time Building Legends presentation team, together with legal and construction sector accord input for today's session. So today we have 4 speakers to give some guidance in this area. First up, we'll set the scene with a lawyer view by Ari Moore, Director of Reflective Construction Law, to set out the legal landscape. Then, during the last lockdowns, the construction sector accord was very helpful in setting a way forward. So next up to speak, we'll have Richard Stone from MB, a senior construction procurement leader with MB, to report on the construction sector accords recommendations. Then, armed with that background, how would a contractor interpret all of that? So our third speaker is Alan Barclay, GM Commercial from Hawkins, who will give a contractor's view on how to deal with all of this. Then it's all very well putting in a claim, but how would that be viewed? So our fourth speaker is Graham Stanich, Director at RCP, who will set out a PM or engineer to the contract view on how claims might be assessed in his view. Now, our speakers have all requested Chatham House rules for all of this, so that they can speak frankly and you don't sue them all later. So we'll finish up at by 5 o'clock, but hopefully there is 5 minutes or so for questions at the end. So get your questions through on the Zoom. So first up, let's get the legal framework from Ari, who is a construction and projects lawyer and as president of the New Zealand Society of Construction Law is highly qualified to address this area. Over to you, Ari.
Thanks, Graham. Yeah, has that come up for everybody, Graham? Can you see my presentation?
All up.
Very good. So, as Graham said, it's a very topical issue at the moment. It wouldn't be a day that goes past without someone calling us and asking these sorts of questions. And really today, I think the other context from a legal point of view is that it's quite a potted summary. So we've got 10 minutes that I'm going to talk about the legal aspects of what are some of the issues we need to deal with in the Omicron environment and the differences from what you may be used to in the lockdowns and the other delays that have happened over the last 2 years. And then talk about how that disruption happens and some of the legal approach and the contract for claiming EOTs and dealing with that. So I think Graham summarised this quite well. Omicron in the last few months has been a changing situation. I mean, I think we're all used to 2 years of sort of the environment we're building in and the environment we're trying to operate in being in flux. And definitely the previous 2 years have been more about, lockdowns will go suddenly and everyone stops. And that's a much easier thing to assess from delays. And Graham will probably follow up with that later on in terms of how engineers would assess it. Now it's about the isolation and having to stay home when you're a household contact or, and that's narrowing as well. So we're still in a period of change. I think we've seen over the last 2 months, the definition of what you had to do really narrow because the government saw some of these productivity issues coming through. And the other context is, it's public. There's a lot of publicity around the 10 to 20% of the workforce isolating, but that has much more of an effect in the construction and sort of manufacturing industry. And I was talking to someone last week who they had one particular trade who had 80% of their warehouse staff off. So one of the other messages here even from a legal point of view is you do have to look at things on a very much a case-by-case basis and what the effect is on the project. So then we say, well, what is the legal position? And really from a legal position, there are 3 different categories of projects. And that comes back to, I think, a message that might be repeated throughout this webinar is it depends what your contract says. So if we look at the contracts and the projects that are still in place from before 2020, they are unlikely to have a COVID clause in them. And all the changes from the pandemic would have been dealt with as a variation, which is consistent with the MB advice and just how the contract's interpreted. That doesn't change for the Omicron and the current disruption. Then you've got the contracts that have been signed in the last 2 years, and pretty much every single one of those contracts will have anticipated some effects of COVID, and then it really depends on what that contract says. Particularly because a lot of the clauses I've seen were written around lockdowns and focusing say more on costs of lockdowns than productivity and supply delays. And then you've got the new projects, the ones that you've been negotiating in the last month. And to deal with that quickly, I think that's a message it's a discussion you need to have with the client and with the engineer about how this will be managed and tracked. And that's a real opportunity to just streamline the approach on assessing these effects. So each of those 3 categories of variations will be dealt with differently. But to generalize for today, typically COVID effects are shared in that they're not a contractor risk. There'll be almost in every case I've seen an entitlement to an extension of time. And in most cases, costs with no allowance for profit. And the only reason that's in brackets is really because some of the harder developer contracts I've seen don't maintain that position. Then we start to look at, well, in the context of entitlements likely to be agreed and quite an easy thing to establish, where for Omicron does it, how do you assess the actual delay? How do you look at the actual costs? Particularly in the context of the absence of fewer workers on site or in manufacturing facilities for structural steel or other products that you'll need. And the thing to highlight is that 3910 does expressly cover loss of productivity and disruption type costs. as being part of a variation and a valid way to assess that. So there isn't any real dispute or any question about whether you can look at productivity. It then becomes how can you substantiate that, and how do you accurately substantiate that? Because we all know how much flux and change there is on a construction project at any given time anyway. So yeah, delay and disruption, it's often called one of the dark arts of sort of projects and especially construction law, because it is very difficult to measure accurately and requires an element of fairness to be approached from both sides. The best approach from a contract point of view is to keep it as simple as possible. Track the effect on the numbers of absences from site, or what the direct effect is, and then also track how that has affected progress during the month, or whatever the frequency is you work to on your project. And there's sort of a few categories of how legally that is best to consider. There's productivity-based assessments of disruption, and then cost-based assessments. The three options there they're all productivity-based assessments. I think out of the discussions I've had over the last month, really the best approach to this type of disruption from Omicron is a productivity approach, and looking at somewhat of a program analysis. And the way that the program analysis is approached in a legal sense is you look at the relevant program for the month, the work that was achieved, and then it's an overlay of the earned value analysis where you bring in the programming, and that reflects in most contracts the requirement in 3910 for comprehensive programs, and most of those updates to be provided monthly, which give a useful yardstick to measure progress during that period. Then we look at the last part I'm going to talk about today before handing back to Graham, is we look at what is the event of delay. And it's easy to say here, step back and say under the contract, well, the requirement to isolate and have workers spending time at home is the event. Although that can be quite messy, and this is it's really the exact example that 3910 is contemplating when you talk about delays that have a continuing effect. So you'll give notice in February or whenever you go notice of a delay, but you don't know the effect of that because you don't know at what point in the wave of cases will your relevant staff have to isolate. And so 3910 says, well, you can give more than one notice. That should be monthly, and you should approach it on a regular basis. And that's my view and our view, and the advice we've been giving is that actually you should be under the 3910 giving little notices often that look back at the say March and go, in March we think we've lost a week's worth of productivity on the critical path because of this. Agree that and move on, rather than waiting till June, say, and looking back and trying to work out where things we're tracking as the easiest way under the contract to deal with that. Look, that's all I have time for today. I'll pass you back to Graham and we can answer any questions at the end. Thank you very much.
Thanks, Ari. Look, the last time around in COVID extensions, MB gave some very helpful steer to the market through the construction sector accord. So I think it's important in terms of setting the scene here. So I'd like to introduce Richard Stone, Senior Construction Sector Leader with MB. So Richard has recently been involved in the development of the Accord's COVID-19 Risk Management Guide. So that's a key part of the puzzle. Over to you, Richard.
Yeah, thank you, Graham, and kia ora koutou. So first off, the Construction Sector Accord, we'd just like to say a big thank you to the New Zealand Institute of Building for enabling the Construction Sector Accord to be involved in this discussion and to present to you our COVID-19 risk management guidelines. So I'm going to give you a very brief whistle-stop tour. I'm not intending to labour on any detailed points, but just to give you a bit of a brief overview of what's in the guide for some of you that may not be aware that it exists. So late last year, so Ari mentioned about the lockdowns and the MB guidance around lockdowns. It was fairly clear that government's position was that a lockdown would entitle contractors potentially to extra costs and time. But there wasn't really anything that talked about loss of productivity, and the Accord foresaw an issue where that was going to start to happen. So we developed this guidance, and really it's a set of tools and principles to follow in managing COVID-19 related risks. It really is focused on the contractor arrangements between the public sector and main contractors. But that's not to say that this guide can't be used for principles between contracts between main contractor and subcontractor, and also principles for consultant agreements. Albeit this guide does focus on 3910, so obviously it is very much tailored to the main contractors. So what does it include? So essentially, there's a number of things in the guide. Talks about the principles of good risk management, talks about who is best placed to manage COVID-19 risk, and I'll come to that in a moment. It really focuses on early engagement and collaboration, which is one of the key things that the Accord promotes. We can solve problems together. It's not always a case of a clause in a contract is, the adversarial approach is kind of a bit traditional, and the Accord really promotes that collaboration to try and solve problems. And I'll come to that a bit more later on in the slides. Talks a little bit about the roles of the project team in managing COVID-19 risks. So everybody on a project's got a role to play in the Accord's view. So everybody from the main contractor, the principal or the client, the engineer to the contract, the project manager, and the design team, because obviously the design team are the ones that are preparing quite often the design for, in a traditional contract, for the contractor to build, and they make decisions on materials and products. So everybody's got a role to play in mitigating risks for COVID-19. The guidance also talks to specific, so 3910 doesn't have, as you might expect in other jurisdictions, force majeure provisions. So when you look at 3910 as it stands at the moment, it's really hard to know where to sort of pitch an issue like COVID-19. So the guidance actually just highlights some of the clauses that you might need to think about if you're considering, for example, entering into a new contract. What kinds of things do you need to be mindful of? And there is actually a really good example of a COVID-19 clause on a particular project that an agency's used, and I'll come to that again in a minute. So it really leads to the question then, who is best placed to manage COVID-19 risk? I think it's fair to say that neither the contractor or client is really able to predict or control the impact of COVID-19. So when I think back to 2 years ago when we had lockdowns, there's been a myriad of public health settings, different isolation periods. There's increased infections. We don't really know how many people are going to turn up to site. So it's really quite hard to try and get any sense of what's actually going to happen. And the supply chain, obviously, that is a major issue. That's a global issue that's affecting, contractors' procurement schedules. The Accord always says good practice to allocate risks to the party best able to manage those. I think that's fairly 101. The Accord actually recommends that agencies, so for government agencies, they retain the risk of the impacts of COVID-19. And that's not to say there's a blank check for contractors to basically come in and ask for time and money for every single issue. But in principle, the Accord believes that if there are real impacts of COVID-19 on a project in terms of time and cost, then agencies should retain the risk. And the reason for that is twofold. The first one really is if I put my contractor's hat on, if I was to try and price the risk, even if I could price the risk and make allowances in my program, I'd have quite a significant program, lots of float in that program. I'd also have quite significant cost provisions. And those things may not eventuate. I mean, what we think about today and how we look at things in 12 months' time, 16 months' time is going to be very different to how we look at things when we get to that point. And maybe these things won't be quite as bad as we think, or maybe they're going to be worse, who knows? But it's really hard to be able to do that now. And the other aspect of this, which probably talks more to in-flight projects, because I'm sure a lot of people will be thinking, well, I've already got a contract, there's nothing for COVID-19. I would urge clients and contractors to have a really good, hard conversation around what is the impact on this project of lost productivity, because I'm sure many of us would have been involved in projects where there have been a number of events, everything's got to be done in the last 6 to 9 months, and it's just all hands on deck, and there's issues with quality, there's issues with health and safety risks. There are all these second order consequences, and yes, we've got contracts, and yes, we can go to arbitration and dispute resolution, but do we really want to get to that point? It would be nice to actually work together and try and come to a solution that's going to work for everybody. So yeah, that's the sort of Accord's recommended position, and this is kind of talking to the position of, the impacts of the Accord's view is impacts are not in the contractor's control, as I've already mentioned. So really, they should be treated as a variation and possibly entitling the contractor to extension of time. If there's a clear demonstration of a delay to the critical path due to COVID, then the Accord believes that should be an extension of time. Equally, the main contractor is very, very intimately aware of the work they're doing. So while the client may have some information, the contractor will have lots of detailed information about their procurement schedule, how that impacts the construction program. And they are best placed to advise on the impacts. I mean, it stands to reason they're in control of the works, they're doing the construction according to their method statements. So one of the good things about 3910, I think, which I really like, is there is advanced notification provision in the contract. So the famous clause 5.21, the contractor can actually use that to notify the engineer. And I think Ari's already alluded to that, kind of letting the engineer to the contract or the principal know that there's an issue as soon as it becomes aware. The parties should work together in a spirit of collaboration and cooperation, and that's really key. I think this is a problem. A problem shared is a problem halved, as it were. So the contractor could request a meeting under that clause and say, look, we'd like to get together, and Ari's already said maybe a regular progress meeting. You could sit down, look at the issues, and give the engineer to the contractor and the principal the opportunity to say, hey, look, is there another way we can solve this problem? Is there another way, for example, the design team can specify a different product to take that off the critical path? So there's all these kinds of things that are at play. And the last point really is about mitigating risks on a no surprises basis. No one really wants umpteen claims at the end of the project when we should be finishing and celebrating the completion. Suddenly we get massive documents with extensions of time. No one really wants that. People want to know what's happening as they go. And the key thing with this 5.21.3 is the engineer to the contract. If the contractor fails to let the engineer to contract know there's a problem, then it's fair and reasonable for the engineer to the contract to say, hey, look, if you'd have told me this 12 months ago, I could have done something with the design team and we could have avoided this delay. So the engineer to contract can actually take that into account in assessing an extension of time. And I think that's a kind of fair and balanced approach to everybody's got a role to play in solving the problem. So I won't go into too much detail on this. This is an example clause, special condition that's been actually used by a government agency. But I thought it was useful just to highlight some of the key words in that. So in this example, there's an extra clause in there that says COVID impact shall be treated as a variation. There's some really good, neat words that align with the Accord principles, which is keep the principal informed, work collaboratively and meet the principal and the engineer to the contract to explore proposals. So this is all about what can we do to try and resolve this. And interestingly, minimise the COVID impacts effect on subcontractors. So I think it's fair to say if we're suggesting that clients or principals should retain the risk and the main contractor shouldn't then take that risk and then, or pass further risk on down to the subcontractors, I think everybody needs to work on the same basis. And the last point there is about trying to obtain the approval of the engineer prior to committing costs. And again, this comes down to surprises. No one really wants to get those claims right at the end of the job because it's too late to do anything about it. And I've just talked about the 5.21.3 clause, which is around, if the contractor hasn't told the engineer to the contract early enough, then that can be taken into account. But the value of a COVID variation in this case is treated the same way any other variation. It's by agreement or as valued under 9.3. So I realise there's a lot of information in here. I would urge you to go and have a look at the guidance on the website, on the Accord website. There's lots of really good stuff in there. And just make sure you talk to your contractor and you talk to your principal. Keep the conversation going. Kia ora. So back to you, Graham.
Yes, thanks, Richard. Look, the lawyers can give us pearls of wisdom, and MB can tell us all to collaborate. But where the rubber meets the road, the builder's got to figure out how to deal with all of that. He's the one steering down the barrel of possibly damages, possibly costs. So I guess we've looked at the background, but we're waiting to hear from Alan. What does a builder think of all that, and how would you recommend moving forward in this environment? Over to you, Graham. Oh, sorry, to you, Alan.
Thanks, Graham. Yeah, so thanks very much. Opportunity to talk through this relevant issue. So what I would say is that in terms of the state of contracts that I see and talking to the rest of the market, it's a real mixed bag. We've got jobs that are still working under contracts that didn't envisage COVID at all. We've then got contracts that came to market after, if you like, COVID became a thing. They now talk about the different levels of lockdown. We've got contracts that talk about traffic lights. We've got contracts who just talk about government restrictions and don't limit it to anything regarding a lockdown or a traffic light system. So I think, as I already mentioned, anytime you get into a situation where you are affected by Omicron, or if you're still trying to deal with any of the previous issues around lockdown or level 3 or level 4 of traffic lights, then you've got to go back and just see what have you signed up to, what have you agreed to do, where did you take the risk, who is taking the risk. And I would say that from what I see in the market and talking to people, that the government's probably taken a much more project-friendly position. And what I mean by project-friendly, they're more interested in making sure that the risks are clearly allocated, that they are paying supply chain, they're paying the subcontractors a fair amount for the impact of that. They've gone as far as including escalation now. So it is more of a best for project kind of view. From commercial contracts, what I'm probably seeing around the market is that it's more focused on what is that risk, who bears the cost of it, what is the split and the allocation between the client and the contractor. And it's clearly defined who bears that risk, who can claim what, when you can claim it, and what your entitlements are. But there is still quite a lot of variances between the individual contracts that come to market. Each lawyer's probably got their own view on what a COVID clause is. Government's got a couple of different variances. So whenever you do price a contract or when you are negotiating, it's always worth tagging it to make sure it's quite clear and to allocate the kind of risk that as a contractor you're willing to take. And then in terms of what the relief is currently out there, time and costs, or time with costs are separate, and that's full or partial relief. So some contracts give you full entitlement, some are allocating a percentage of entitlement to some contracts might allocate 50%, 7% share. Some contracts out there do give some escalation relief. So if there's an impact on material costs due to COVID, then particularly the Ministry of Education can order contracts and some of the defence contracts that's out there, you are entitled to some relief, providing you've followed the process. Some will only give you an on-site only cost. So if you've got impact off-site, then you've got no entitlement. Some contracts give a time only, and on the odd occasion still there are some contracts that come out to the market that essentially give you no relief, which is why I'm saying you've got to tag it back to a position that you're comfortable with as a contractor to proceed with. So what to do if you've been impacted? So first thing I would say you've got to do is just check what your contract states, and then determine how and what has been impacted on your project. So what I mean by that is it an off-site? Is it your structural steel subcontractor who's working off-site who can't manufacture? Is it a material supply? Is it something overseas that means you can't get it into the country? What is it? What is the impact on your contract? What can you physically do about it? And what is the actual impact immediately, and what's the impact going forward? I would then say go back and just check your contract, just to make sure that you know exactly what you're entitled to claim and what relief is available, and then start basically collating your records. So there's a lot of, I think Ari mentioned, Omicron and how you track these things, but essentially what you've got on, in my mind, it's just a variation. It's just an entitlement to a variation, or it's just an entitlement to an extension of time, or it's an entitlement to both. So how do you do that? It's the same as any other thing. You've got to have good records. You've got to understand the number of staff you've got on your project, the number of workers you've got on your project. What did you have before the impact? What have you got during the impact? And what have you got after the impact? And that's particularly important if you want to try and demonstrate any impact on productivity reduction. So if you can show in February, if you like, that you were producing and hitting every target that you had in your contract, Omicron comes along, your numbers have been reduced dramatically, and you're only doing half the activities that you said you were, then that's a good place to start to demonstrate any kind of entitlement. Clearly understand what materials have been impacted, and always make sure that your program is up to date. If you've got an up-to-date program, it's a lot easier to demonstrate the impact of any of these delays that you're going to incur. I would also, just to say, don't be a postbox on these costs. There's nothing worse than trying to present the case or demonstrate your entitlement, and somebody comes back and says, well, what about this, and have you gone through this? And if you haven't done your homework and you haven't gone through and demonstrated what your costs are, if you haven't gone through and done some due diligence, if you've got any supply chain costs coming through, then it kind of weakens your position, and it kind of looks like that you're, from a contractor's perspective, if you're the client or the engineer, then it's just kind of something that just delays the agreement process, because it's, well, have you looked at that? No, I haven't done that yet. Well, come back once you've done that. You know, if there's less opportunity to pick holes in what you're presenting, and if you've done a good job in presenting the information, you've done it accurately, you've demonstrated that you've done some due diligence, and you're not just being a postbox, then it's a lot harder for somebody to say that you don't have an entitlement. I would also suggest that as soon as there's any kind of impact, or you think there is any kind of impact coming, get a notice out as soon as possible. Either under the early warning process that we've got under 3910, or a specific notice of delay, depending on the situation you've got. But the quicker you get it out to the engineer, to the contractor, to the client, and start having conversations about what the impact is, either on the productivity or on the critical path, then the more likelihood that you'll get a better response from the engineer and the client, and the more likelihood that you might be able to mitigate some of this, or reach an agreement on the impact a lot earlier. From an entitlement perspective, I'll put these into two. So it's cost incurred, but it doesn't have a critical path impact. So for what I've seen is there's quite a lot of impacts or cost incurred due to COVID or Omicron that might not actually impact a critical path. So you're not talking about an extension of time event, but something has occurred that means the cost of delivering this contract has increased because of COVID. So again, check your contract. What does it say? What is your entitlement? It might be a deemed variation. So under the contract, you might have a different process where you've got to provide additional notification if a deemed variation has occurred. So again, you've got to really understand what you've got to present and get that information out as quickly as you can. Even if it's in a provisional format, or even if it's a kind of almost like a heads of claim, these are the areas I've been impacted on. I'm currently collating this, but as an early warning or as a notice, an event has occurred. I think it's a deemed variation or variation of the contract, and this is what we're doing. Again, calculate that cost incurred in line with the contract. So different contracts have got different processes for dealing with COVID. So don't think just because you've got one on one job, it's the same that you've got to do on the next contract. If you look at the different contracts that's out in the market, quite a few of them have got a different process you've got to go through. You've got a different entitlement to costs. So you've got to make sure that you're compliant with your contract. And then again, just you've got to do your due diligence, you've got to present it correctly, you've got to make sure that your costs are accurate. And if that means it's a staged approach where you put a provisional amount in, you follow up with additional information later on, then that's a process you've got to do. And that includes if it's a disruption claim, if it's a straight variation claim. The more records that you can present to substantiate what you've the effect of the delay or the effect of that variation, the better chance you have of getting some kind of payment or getting agreement with the engineer. The next one is a state program and cost impact. So again, as I said there, you've got to check what your contract says. What notices have you got to issue? When have you got to issue a notice? Is that 20 days for extension of time? Is it 10 days? Have you got to issue an early warning notice? Have you got to issue a specific notice citing a particular COVID clause? Can you demonstrate that the critical path is actually being affected? Have you got an up-to-date program? Have you been baselining it correctly every month? You know, just the basic things around what you should do to make sure that you are able to get an entitlement to an extension of time. Just because it's COVID, it's no different. If you've got an up-to-date program, you can demonstrate that that critical path has been impacted, and you can demonstrate clearly there's a cost associated with that under the contract, then it's no different to any other extension of time. You've got an entitlement. As long as you can demonstrate it, as long as you've got the right information, then the engineer or if you're dealing directly with your client, depending on the kind of contract you've got, should be taken along the journey. They should understand and they should be willing to award and agree costs. Part of that is just to track your impacted activity. So if you've got, as an example, if your structural steel is impacted, if you can demonstrate that pre-Omicron or COVID that you were erecting X ton a day or X ton a week, then you were in line with your program. Through that, impacted if you're delivering half that output, and you can run different things, Microsoft or Primavera or Asta, whatever you're running, then again, it's quite easy to demonstrate if you've got the right information and the tools in place. Other things I suggest you should be doing is tracking your trade-specific site numbers. So it's always a good thing to know how many people you've got on your site every day from a health and safety perspective. But if you can break that down into the specific trades, and you can demonstrate what the number of trades were before the Omicron or the isolation process or whatever the COVID impact is, demonstrate what it is through that period, and then demonstrate how quickly you can get back to that. And then you can clearly show what that blip is. And again, it's something that should help you demonstrate your entitlement. Put your notices in as quick as you can. 521 is a great thing. Get that early warning in. As soon as you're able to put your extension of time in, put that in. If you're not clear on the final impact, then generally 3910 unamended allows you to do that, but normally even 3910 with specials enables you to give an update every 10 days, every 5 days, every 20 days, whatever it is. I'm still not clear on what the impact is, or the impact is still going. As soon as I'm aware, I can finalise it. And then calculate your costs incurred in line with the contract. And again, just make sure that you've done that due diligence. Make sure that you've presented a robust position. Demonstrate that if you've got some costs from subcontractors or supply chain, that you can actually demonstrate that you've done your homework and you're not just a post box. In terms of subcontractors and COVID, particularly in the first lockdown and as we went through the kind of last 18 months, then I would say that some clients, and some engineers and some clients' QSs, for some reason, don't seem to think that subcontractors had any entitlement. My view is, unless the head contract specifically excludes the fact that you're not entitled to claim a subcontractor cost, then a subcontractor cost is just a variation. You've got a process you've got to deal with, you've got to demonstrate your costs. So if you've got a contract that enables you to claim subcontractors, then provided a subcontractor has put forward some kind of costs and you've done some review and due diligence of that, then you should be entitled to claim that. From a subcontract perspective, I do think you've got to always make sure that you've checked what you've contracted your supply chain to. You've got to be careful it's not just a direct flow down what's in your head contract flowing down into your subcontract, it does kind of change and alter. So hopefully you're not in a position where you've got a conflict between what the subcontractor has presented to the contractor, and then the contractor's in a kind of awkward position where the contractor's agreed something with the client which is different to the subcontractor, and somebody's out of kilter, somebody's going to pay the cost of that. So again, understand what your subcontract process is, understand what your supply chain have signed up to, make sure that you're not conflicted, and make sure you're back to back. And one of the things I've seen coming back from engineers and I suppose clients and clients' cases is, you know, demonstrate the entitlement that a subcontractor has under the head contract. Normally under clause 4, generally all the specials that are right now changing 3910 will say that you've got to subcontract your supply chain in generally the same terms as the head contract, so you can go to that position. If you're in a process where it's an open book procurement, then make sure the supply chain are aware, and then when you go through that sign off with the client, or the client's case, or the engineer, that you're quite specific around what tags are in there. And then also just make sure that you're in a back-to-back as much as possible when you're in that lump sum situation, that your supply chain is priced in a like manner that you've priced your client. And all that means you've always got to make sure that you carry out due diligence of your supply chain claims before presenting it to the engineer or to the client. In terms of what I'm seeing out in the market and talking to colleagues across the industry, what I would suggest is when you are having conversations around entitlement on your extension of time or your variations due to COVID, it's always better to go directly to the top of the tree for the dialogue. And that might be the client, or it might be the engineer to the contract. I think the quicker you get to that, the people who can make the decision, the better. Otherwise, you end up in a bit of sometimes a circular loop where you're having conversations with the consultants QS who won't agree anything until you've got a CI, or they might have a view on what the entitlement is or how you calculate out costs based on previous contracts and not actually understand the position of this particular contract. You might have an engineer rep who has a different view. So until you get to the person who is there contracted to make that decision, you're kind of wasting a little bit of time and a little bit of wasted energy. That essentially just means that you'll bear the cost as a contractor until you get agreed. So whoever's at the top of the tree, if that's the engineer or if it's the client, I've seen some COVID contracts where the client wants to agree the position and not the engineer. So you've got to understand who do you need to talk to and how quickly can you get to that conversation. I would say, again, from an entitlement perspective, it's still a little bit mixed. You get positions where I've seen engineers, reps and QSs trying to negotiate rather than apply what's been agreed under the contract. There seems to be a little bit of a strange view sometimes on what the definition of cost is. So it's clearly defined under the contract what is cost. Some people seem to have a view of you can claim certain costs under standard variation, but when it comes to COVID variation, then sometimes the costs are not quite the same, and they kind of seem to think that sometimes things are cheaper, or a cost under one variation might not be deemed to be another cost under another variation, and it might be, oh, well, that's not a true cost, or you need to really demonstrate that. And what I've heard in the market and seen sometimes is that some of the scrutiny and the information that people are asking for kind of goes beyond the realms of what the contract says. So I think you've just got to stick to what the contract says, stand your ground, and just make sure that you're compliant with the contract that you've signed up. Then it's quite hard for somebody to disagree with what you said. But as I say, I haven't heard of a COVID claim going beyond the contract yet, and what I mean by that, I haven't heard of anyone who's gone to adjudication or mediation or any other third-party dispute. So what seems to happen today is that the values haven't been that great, if you like. The parties can't eventually agree something. That might mean that it's slightly different to your claim, or you might have to take a position, or you might have to meet a mitigated position at the end of the day. But as I say, I haven't heard of anyone yet who's gone complete toys out the pram and taken it to a third party. Last slide here is just kind of what's next. So what I'm seeing in the market is that to mitigate kind of the impact of COVID and the ongoing risk around Omicron, is that certainly materials are getting ordered earlier and earlier. Clients are willing to now pay for off-site materials as soon as it's available. Used to be in the market that clients would pay for materials probably a month or two before it was needed on site. Now, a lot of clients are willing to pay for that material as soon as it can be ordered and stored off-site. Clients are now paying deposits, which is kind of 2 years ago was unheard of. Some projects have started having some off-site storage facilities where they can either through the client or off your own back as a contractor, allocate a specific place, fill it with as much materials as you can, so that when you do need it on site, it's ready. I do think that the COVID and the Omicron impact will be here for quite a while. I think it will kind of fluctuate around the risk profile and who takes that. And it will kind of probably take a lull for a while, and it might come back again. So I think it's going to be topical for a while yet. And I think in terms of how that's dealt with going forward, then, you know, who knows, it might come to a position where, similar to wet weather, contractors are asked to take a bit of a view in terms of their program and their costs to make some kind of allowance. You know, you might say, well, let's make sure you've allowed 10 days associated with Omicron downtime in your program, and build it in as float. I think we'll start to see the government take less of an interest in it. It'll become more of an industry issue, and then what that means is there's probably going to be less government mandates being issued, less change in law positions or notices from the government being issued. So the industry has got to find a way of dealing with this and working together to try and mitigate the risk and actually agree the impact of this going forward. So yeah, that's for me. Over to Graham. I think 2 Grahams.
Yeah, thanks.
Graham 2.
Thanks, Alan. It was all good stuff, and appreciate your time there, Alan. Jumping off. So just wrapping it all up now, we've got Graham Stanage, Director at RCP. So Graham's a very experienced engineer to the contract and project manager. He's been a Building Legends presenter on Extensions for Time. So we need a project manager, engineer to the contract view to see whether any of these claims are justified. What do you think, Graham?
Oh, thank you, Graham, and thanks very much to the previous speakers, all very informative, and I'm sure there'll be a few themes that from the previous presentations that will come through in my presentation now. Just to emphasise, I think it came from Alan just earlier. I see that there's a lot of similarities really with the previous presentations that we've delivered in the past on extensions of time, particularly when it comes to the administration of Omicron related and COVID related extension of time claims. Fundamentally, from an engineer's perspective, the principles remain the same. Obviously, there's an overlay with the current environment and how the current environment's influencing conditions. But I think largely the fundamentals remain the same. So I'll go over those briefly in a second. Obviously, presently we've got current conditions that are introducing delay and disruption, principally through the resource availability or lack thereof of labour and plant and materials. And really it's how are these delays and disruptions being felt and presented in a different fashion to the previous COVID related delays and extensions of time that were addressed under the alert level 3 and alert level 4, and also to an extent with some of the geographical issues and constraints that that we've experienced since. So I'll quickly just run through some of the key principles and fundamentals that really I'd be looking for is in the administration of an extension of time claim. At the heart of the matter is really know the contract. If you're preparing a claim and you think you've got a claim before you actually submit it, read and understand what your contract says, and in particular its special conditions. That there's widespread knowledge really about the standard New Zealand Standard 3910. Often we perhaps see a lack of familiarity with special conditions, and that's can often be through maybe a contractor's representative who's perhaps not been familiar with the development and the review and the clarification process around the preparation of the contract. But it's fundamental to everything really that the contractors are presenting is understanding of the contract. Obviously, you've got to understand what's giving grounds to the claim. Clearly, something would have occurred that's affected the contractor's ability to deliver, that's had an effect on the time and an effect on the cost. And also that the evidence of those effects can be presented, and I'll come on to that later on. The notice of delays is basically allows the contractor to inform the engineer and the principal, which I'll come on to, and then make sure that the claims are prepared thoroughly. All standard fare really for the preparation of any claim, be it COVID related or not. So coming to the notice of delay, that's been a common thread, as I'm sure you'll have heard through the earlier presentations. It should really be given as early as possible, as soon as there's an awareness of any circumstance that the contractor becomes aware of. But in saying that, there is also an obligation on the principal under the standard clause of the contract 521, I think, that the principal has an obligation to inform the contractor as well. But obviously in this one, the prevalent nature will be that the contractor is going to inform the engineer and principal. I kind of like Ari's premise of little and often. It keeps that allows us the engineer and principal to be kept informed, and also allows them to undertake potential mitigation options. Measurable delay and sufficient detail to allow the engineer to understand and identify the cause of the delay. Notice should say what provisions is notified, what activities and trades, and also what mitigation measures may have been able to be taken place, or if the contractor has perhaps even effected some mitigation measures, what were they and how did they mitigate the problem. Again, before the claims issued, be aware of your contract, and in particular be familiar with any COVID event provisions. As was said earlier, we're beginning to see a number of different forms of contract as to how the COVID events are being catered for within contracts. So be familiar with that. Be aware of where their allocation of risk sits. Understand what your claim process under the contract and whether you've actually followed those before your claim is issued. Program I'll come on to in a second, and understand the status of the programme before you're justifying your claim. What mitigation measures, as I've said, document what was done. Concurrent delay needs to be considered as well within the body of your claim, and we could probably talk much longer about concurrency of delay, but it's important that you understand if there has been any concurrent delays, as that may affect the assessment and the impact of delay with subcontractors, and if you've got any backup documentation. And I like the earlier comment, don't just postbox those. There needs to be filtered information to show that there is actually some judgment being made before it's just passing on subcontractors' information through to the engineer. And then what we've seen and what we've talked about in the past is actually pulling together checklists and making sure that you've actually got all those constituent parts in your EOT prepared prior to its issue. We can circulate those perhaps with some of the documents afterwards. Fundamentally, in order to demonstrate delay, there needs to be a current programme, and it's an absolutely key aspect. So the programme really needs to be kept up to date, and that first point there, it's got to be in sufficient detail so that we can measure progress or delay, or the effects of a delay against the activities against which your claim is being lodged. It's commonplace perhaps for contract programs to have a series of lengthy Gantt items that we've seen them in the past 90, 100 days or whatever, and it's very difficult to tease out the true delay that's affected the progression of an activity that hasn't got a level of detail attached to it. So, you know, it could be seen that keeping them vague allows for a little bit of flexibility, but it can actually work against the contractor from the perspective of being able to demonstrate accurately where the delays occurred. So I think that's an important aspect. The critical path is an important inclusion within your programme too. I think it's beholden really on contractors to update and issue on a regular basis the programme that they're currently working to. Again, we often see programmes that are way out of kilter with the methodology and progress levels that have been achieved. Again, making it very, very hard to actually assess where the delay has occurred, and even if it has occurred. So I think it's important for a contractor to update regularly and publicise them, circulate them, keep everyone informed of what the programme is. The contract only requires the due date for completion to be met. The manner in which the contractor gets there, putting aside any interim milestones or separable portions or whatever they may be, but the important thing is that the due date for completion is met. How the contractor gets there is largely up to the contractor. So if your methodology changes, advise the team, advise the principal, keep the engineer informed, and that in itself will allow you then to more accurately demonstrate delay. So I'm just conscious of time, Graham. I can maybe quickly flick through on the what the engineer will do. Just basically a whole assessment period. We'll check that the notice has been provided, that what critical activities were claimed to be delayed. We address also whether there's any float in there. But the last one there is really, we would undertake a detailed review of the records and documentation that are going to support your claim. So particularly, go on to in a second, in relation to these inefficiencies, which are largely being coming to the surface now, It's how do we actually assess the true manner in which progress has been affected, current rates of progress versus previous. If manpower levels are down significantly on that, how can that be accurately demonstrated? Have you got records of what your manpower levels were pre-COVID or outside of any restrictions versus where are they now? So records, can't emphasize the importance of keeping good records. We'll look to jointly examine any opportunities to mitigate, consider acceleration. There'll be an independent assessment of the statements and any other evidence that's presented to us. And then obviously there'll be an issue of costs and time should it be appropriate. So fundamentally, has the due date really actually been delayed by an event, and can this delay be demonstrated against that most recent programme? Concurrencies a consideration. There'll be, if the engineer is in agreement and is accepting of validity of claim, there'll be awards with time. There'll be potentially costs associated with the delay, and these can be split into the direct costs, indirect costs, and there'll be subcontractor costs are a hot topic, and there is some there's divergent opinions in the market as to how those are administered. My own position on subcontractors' costs is that I don't think there's a one case fits all. I think there is potential if a subcontractor can demonstrate that their ability to complete the works has been directly affected by a COVID-related event, and that there has been costs that they're incurring, tangible costs associated with that, then they may be considered. But equally, the counter to that is there a business risk balance as well that needs to be applied. And then the offsite overheads and profit, we're seeing with COVID claims that there's an element of offsite overheads that is often valid. The common view with COVID claims is that profit is excluded from claims, and that's largely on the premise that as the event is largely outside of the control of the principal and the contractor, the question is it equitable that someone should profit out of the situation? So moving to just my last slide here, it's fundamentally how we're going to measure the inefficiency. There's with absenteeism, it's records around your staff and labour and subcontractors, material shortages, and is supply chain shortage materially affecting the contractor's ability to complete the works, to which in those sort of circumstances we would be looking to, well, has the contractor actually sought to place orders at an appropriate time within their programme, and is that a reasonable, I mean, given where the supply chain is at the moment, we would be asking questions really around, well, were all endeavours made at the appropriate time to procure materials, and if that's still resulted in delay, then we may look at considering that as a attributable cause. As Ari's mentioned before, we look at the measured mile system, which is basically comparing the actual pre-event progress levels compared to the post-event progress levels, and that largely starts to build up a picture of the reasonableness of the claim. We can look at cash flow comparisons, how the cash flow has actually been affected against current versus predicted, and then also the ongoing delay. my view on those would be get the claims in, albeit that the COVID related matters are potentially going to be with us. Get the claims in, get them settled as quickly as you can, and then we can move on to subsequent events. But at least if they're ongoing, I would be looking to seek settlement of those as quickly as possible. But fundamentally, the last point there around the records, if the contractors keep good records, if the principals keep good records, and if the engineers and engineers reps keep good records of progress, of manpower, of events, if you get your notices in promptly, don't let issues fester. Those are the things that will lead to ideally towards a satisfactory resolution on claims. So that's me. Sorry if I was a bit rushed towards the end, but with that, I'll perhaps pass back to Graham.
Thanks, Graham. Look, we are well over time. It looks like we might have bitten off a bit too much in this for 1 hour, and we might have to organise 2.0 to get into a bit more detail. So in the interest of time, I think we better wrap up there. There was one quick question about ARI, which was the 3910 clause, which provides for productivity and disruption claim. With ARI, could you quickly answer that one?
Yeah, that question from Peter, it's clarified in the guidelines, Peter, which don't have contractual force, but are definitely relevant to how to read the variation clauses. Okay,
look, it's, as I said, it's well over time, so I think all the slides are available on the website, so NZIB will make all those available after the session. But can I just really thank all of those presenters again, very generous with their time preparing for today and coming along. They must dread when my name comes up on their phone. What is this guy going to ask me to do this time? But really want to thank you for your time. It's a bit courageous to get up in front of 300 of your peers who may have a different view on many of these things. So thank you again, presenters, and thanks for everyone for supporting this NZIB webinar. We'll get the notes out to everybody, and it looks like we might have to organise 2.0 to get down to a bit more detail. Thanks, everybody.
Thank you.
Thanks, Graham.